Most people would be surprised if I told them that Rem actually gets a lot of hate as a character. And even though most of the time, whenever people are actually thinking about the anime, they are thinking about Rem being the best girl, and many people amongst the anime fandom actually really do like Rem. But however, that isn't particularly a popular take, or as popular of a take as within the light novels, right? Especially due to the fact that there's just a lot of headcanon which goes around whenever they're speaking about Rem specifically, which is used to sort of either degrade her as a character or make Rem appear evil. I really don't particularly understand this whole narrative, which many anime fans, especially rezero fans, have, where they think that just because a character does things which are morally reprehensible, therefore they are a bad character, or therefore they do not align with the set sort of role that people within the fandom are attempting to assign to them. But yeah, a majority of the discourse actually stems from like what Rem did in Arc 2, where she actually kills Subaru. And there's a few points which people make that like sort of doesn't make sense whenever we contextualize it within the series, such as Puck and Beatrice being capable of sensing emotions, where most of the argument basically goes like this, that Puck and Beatrice both can sense emotions. And since they can sense emotions, they would also know that Subaru is guilty if he was actually a witch cultist. Therefore, Rem choosing to kill him in spite of this justification, that therefore means that Rem is just entirely malicious and an evil person. Something along those lines. Maybe they won't use the words that she's evil or a malicious person, but they will definitely try and say that like Rem did something extremely irrational. But when we actually choose to actually look at Beatrice and Puck's emotion sensing within the series, we can note that it just isn't nearly as reliable as many people actually try and frame it. Whenever Beatrice and Puck are sensing emotions, they are sensing things based on the current moment. And what I mean by that is, whatever you're feeling in the current moment, when they sense it, they'll be capable of actually discerning what you're feeling. Of course, if your emotions change over time, then of course they won't be capable of sensing what you're feeling. For a major example of this is like, for example, Elsa. Puck can sense emotions, yet Puck could not actually sense Elsa coming up behind Emilia with the intent to kill, simply because A, she was simply hiding her emotions, and B, he wasn't actually attempting to sense her emotions at the time. So it's something which is manual and also something which doesn't give you a permanent clear. For example, say like so a murderer actually walked into your house, and then at the time of the murder, so like somebody had an extremely good alibi for that person. That alibi only clears them for that one specific murder. However, if another person gets murdered at the time, obviously the alibi no longer applies because it's an entirely different scenario and it's a one-time pass and a one-time excuse. Obviously, in the case of Subaru, whenever Subaru has miasma, it's quite obvious that given that Rem already thinks he's a witch cultist, that his intentions might change at any moment and change towards violence. And it really doesn't particularly mean anything that they cleared them because their emotion sensing abilities aren't actually things which are omnipotent. Furthermore, witch cultists, as per their own nature specifically, are people who are defined as people who are capable of actually like shifting and blending into the environments, blending in with the civilians. In fact, it's stated by the author that most, if not all of the witch cultists actually are people blending in with regular civilians. And then, upon actually gaining orders from their gospel, then they are actually capable of enacting mass violence. And due to this, we can actually just see that if Rem thought Subaru was a witch cultist, nobody else in the mansion noticing him is already expected if she thinks she's a witch cultist because they are trained in actually sneaking into other people's homes without being detected, sneaking into places without being detected. A main example of this is in Rem's side story, where Rem and Frederica are going out to the capital and there are actually witch cultists there, and only Rem is capable of sensing them. Rem tries to relay the information to Frederica. Frederica obviously doesn't believe her because Frederica obviously can't sense the miasma. And since Frederica can't sense the miasma, the witch cultists almost get away. However, Reinhard obviously intervenes. But what that actually shows us is that not only are like witch cultists actually capable of blending in, but also given that actually sensing killing intent is something which most people in ReZero can do. We actually see it in the volume 8 or 9, I'm presuming, where the knights are capable of easily sensing Puck's own killing intent towards Subaru, right? They're capable of sensing that. But sensing killing intent is something which people can do, yet these people are still incapable of actually determining that there's a witch cultist within the royal capital. Frederica herself is incapable of determining that there's a witch cultist amongst the royal capital, and only Reinhard and Rem are capable of doing so. So this already not only gives Rem a background reason to just like not relay this sort of information to other people, because why would she tell other people that she thinks there's a witch cultist there if she already doesn't think that they believe her because of the fact that they can't sense the witch's sense, and this is already something which she has a traumatizing experience with in her childhood. right? So obviously, like when we look at it contextually, that it sort of does make sense why like Rem wouldn't actually relate this information with anyone else, because she doesn't think she would be believed. And also, even if you say that it isn't perfectly rational, it's obviously something that we can understand. We can sort of understand why she did it, even if it wasn't the per se like, perfectly rational thing to do. In the same way, we can understand why Subaru does a lot of things which he does, right? Because we are looking at things from the outside, we can understand why he's doing a lot of things, even if we can acknowledge that they aren't fully rational. And because we can understand that, right, and because we are able to empathize with Subaru, we don't all constantly actually try and criticize Subaru because of the fact that he's because of the fact that he does things which are irrational sometimes. Because obviously our thought would be, yeah, he's a kid, he's a human, of course he's going to make mistakes. That's what it means to be a person, that's what it means to be a thought character. But for some odd reason, people seem to be incapable of extending this same sort of grapevine to somebody like Rem, which also sort of applies to characters like Ram or Emilia herself, where they are just consistently incapable of holding these standard characters to standards aside from absolute perfection. But I'm going to give you an analogy to sort of display how like Ram's mindset probably was within this arc. Imagine you are a person who is going through psychosis, and you think that your parents are trying to trick you into opening your door so that they would then kill you. And then you see your parents, they're crying on the floor, begging you to open the door, and telling you that, oh my goodness, and we would never do this. A third party outsider comes in and asks, why would they cry like this if they intended to kill you? Well, your answer would obviously be, well, of course they'd cry like that because they're trying to trick me, because they want to kill me, right? Obviously. And that just sort of shows that two different people can have different interpretations on the same evidence. Because she already thinks he's a witch cultist, him blending in and nobody calling him out on him being suspicious is already something you would expect of a witch cultist, because they are naturally designed to sneak into people's homes, right? And because of the fact that Beatrice's sensing ability alongside Puck's is not something which is omnipotent, right? It's sort of obvious why she wouldn't actually place her full trust in those things, right? So like people trying to make these sort of arguments and like criticisms towards Rem, specifically for her not trusting people who she isn't particularly close to, right? Like Rem is not somebody who's particularly close to somebody like Beatrice, somebody like Puck at the time. She isn't close to any of them aside from her sister, right? So through all of that, she doesn't even trust these people. Why would she even believe their word? In fact, there's even a note within volume 3 that she's actually so surprised at the feeling of actually being capable of trusting and relying on somebody else whenever Subaru comes in the final loop, showing that like Rem was not actually somebody who trusted others, right? So obviously the word of a great spirit and like Puck, a great spirit, Puck, like Beatrice, right? Obviously neither of those two things would matter as much, right? So they wouldn't really mean anything. But on top of that, right, this is also stacked on top of the fact that in the second leap, what you can actually see is quote-unquote the most incriminating for Rem, especially considering she and Subaru were like smiling with one another beforehand, right? It's sort of made clear later on within the series why she actually killed him there. And the reason why she actually killed him there is because, as is noted by the narrative and as is noted by the narrator, right, Subaru was specifically ignoring the basic law of a rule of self-preservation that every single living being has, and that is something which is telltale for a witch cultist. And there's an actual example of this within the series. For example, whenever Rem is fighting the witch cultist, even though she's capable of individually overwhelming all of them, right, because of the fact that they actually ignore their own sense of self-preservation, not only does it allow them to exert more strength without actually caring about their own stamina, but it also allows them to do suicide attacks without a care in the world. And it is because Subaru shows that distinct quality that no other person has from Rem's experience aside from witch cultists, and he's going to the silver-haired half-elf's room at the very dead of night, obviously shows that, okay, maybe something is up with this guy, and maybe I was actually horribly wrong for actually trusting him, which actually causes hurt on her own end. And obviously we know from our perspective, because we're from a third-person omniscient perspective, that actually this isn't true for Subaru, but Rem doesn't actually get access to any of this information, right? And because of that, we need to think of things from how the characters actually see things and the characters' actual pool of information compared to actually appealing to our own third-person standards, because by that metric, anyone can critique Subaru and make him look like a horrid character, which is like obviously actually true. On top of all of that, And you also have the people who consistently try and overplay the amount of time which like Rem tortured Subaru. And you will notice that whenever I bring up this point, whenever I say that people generally are overplaying the amount of time Subaru got tortured, people say that it was actually for hours, when in reality it was likely not even over 30 minutes, right? People try and say that it was she tortured him for hours, but then in reality, when you just try and ask them, okay, why exactly is it that you are trying to overplay an already bad thing and making it appear like a worse thing? Why are you trying to do that? The answer becomes like obvious, and it becomes really simple, because specifically they actually want it to be worse than it is, so that they can make a character they already don't like look even worse than they are. If they really cared about the situation as much as they actually did, they would have acknowledged the fact that they specifically did not, they overestimated the amount of time the torture took place, but were still actually capable of acknowledging how bad it is. But I don't really get how people are actually capable of doing this, and I think it stems from their own insistence on not actually giving any ground where they actually admit that Rem isn't as bad as they think she is, right? But they are actually incapable of doing so. Whether it's them actually saying that From Zero actually was a toxic scene, it displays Rem's like idealization of Subaru, even though Rem is like stated in the text to be the one most critical of Subaru. But we're going to ignore that because obviously we're Twitter users, we're like Reddit users, right? We obviously need to push an agenda here, right? But regardless of those facts, people are just like fundamentally incapable of giving any ground on her being a better character than they thought, and because of that, the sort of discourse whenever it comes to Rem just ends up going really nowhere, because it ends up with you continuing to like pull up evidence that somebody is incorrect, or me doing that as well, right? And then the same person just ends up turning around and either A, just like no longer replying, right? Or B, just saying that regardless of that, they still dislike her anyways. And it's like, okay, cool, you can still dislike this character, but at least acknowledge that you were incorrect about what you were saying, and then stop saying it. Because obviously, regardless of whether or not it makes the action right or wrong, right, it is still in misinformation. And if it's misinformation, it ought to be corrected. However, people, again, are just fundamentally incapable of acknowledging these things. Obviously, this isn't to say that Rem is like flawless. Obviously, Rem goes through same or similar like sort of identity issues with somebody like Subaru. She goes through the same sort of self-hatred issues, goes through the same sort of like self-erasure issues that Subaru actually goes through, right? And these are all flaws that her character has, which also like leads to her doing things due to her own like lack of self-esteem, such as her not actually like getting a lot of opportunities to be around Subaru because she's constantly working, so she has to actually force herself to be around him, Subaru, when it's at nighttime or when he's sleeping. Obviously, this isn't something that Subaru himself particularly cares about, but it obviously does display a flaw in Rem's own character, in the fact that she doesn't actually think she's deserving of more time for Subaru, to the extent where she can just ask, but instead needs to like do it in a roundabout manner. But regardless of that fact, obviously, since we can acknowledge that she has flaws, does not mean that suddenly we are now fine with like people overplaying like flaws which like characters have. In the same way how people are fine with saying like Subaru has self-hatred issues. But if you try to say that, okay, Subaru also has sexual violence issues, that would obviously be incorrect. And me saying that that's incorrect wouldn't be me saying that, oh my god, you're trying to say that Subaru is flawless, which is then making him a worse character, right? Which is this sort of argument that many Twitter users like to make, when in reality all you're just saying is that maybe they just don't have the flaws that you are trying to ascribe to them. And when people actually hear those words, they just get really irritated for some reason, and they just try and conflate these two ideas. And it's extremely odd, because I don't really know why people do this. And these actual like issues where they refuse to give ground, or Rem haters in general refuse to give any form of ground about Rem being like a good character, still can go from either saying that From Zero was toxic for Subaru, saying From Zero was negative for Subaru, trying to take the scene where Rem is like, oh my goodness, I've let down my guard in front of this guy so much, so even if he tried to actually attack me in my sleep, I wouldn't even be capable of noticing. People then change that to, oh my goodness, Rem would be fine if Subaru sexually assaulted her, when in reality that just isn't true. And that just stems from like the Yen press doing another like, oh well, not specifically Yen press doing another mistranslation, but people like interpreting assault, right, or attack to mean sexual assault for some odd reason. And obviously we know like why the reason is, because like they don't like the character, right? But like even externally to all that, I think it should be like pertinent that you can dislike a character while also being objective about the things which they've done. Or you can also look at the scene where like Rem says that Subaru like isn't a hero, when like, okay, she says he isn't a hero after the sort of like after he accomplishes a quote-unquote bloodless siege, right? But you notice that people on TikTok will also insistently say that Rem is actually saying Subaru isn't my hero, but instead she says Subaru isn't a hero in general. Subaru not being a hero and Subaru not being Rem's hero are two completely independent concepts. At least that's how the narrative frames it. And even if Subaru interprets them to mean the same thing, obviously what's in question here, considering they're actually looking at Rem's own character, right, would be the intent behind Rem's expression of it. And I don't think it's anything more complicated than the fact that Subaru was trying to deny her of her agency. Essentially, she's actually having a mental breakdown and thinking she's useless because she couldn't save Zelda. Then Subaru comes into her room telling her about how he's more useless than she is, acting as if he should hold himself to some supreme expectations that she herself cannot actually meet up to, so she's therefore excluded by default, right? And that's why she tells him he isn't a hero, right? But obviously, like, that's excluding all of those, like excluding that sort of context, right? You would just say, oh, she said you aren't my hero, so that then it can be a cool callback to the From Zero scene, and then you can actually have some like weird excuse to hate Rem in Arc 7. And even if we like look at Rem in Arc 7, you can obviously notice an immediate like issue where Rem in Arc 7 is fundamentally a similar sort of person, where immediately, even though like Subaru has the worst possible start with her, where Subaru is actually thinking of murdering a child in front of her, Rem not only doesn't kill him, even though she could easily break his neck, but also is like completely fine with sacrificing her life so that Subaru is capable of surviving. Which is also why they'll have a whole bunch of like romantic moments where like Zelda calls Rem his woman, and like Subaru tells like Burstets like within the Azamuku that nobody else can have Rem by him. But like in general, most of this discourse about like Rem's character as a whole just stems from a fundamental sort of dishonesty that the fandom itself seems incapable of actually replicating. But with that being said, it's obviously on the obligation of the reader to actually interpret the text correctly. And while usually within the like fiction, into like correct interpretations aren't things which really exist because it's mostly subjective, this is not one of these cases. And I think in most of the Rem discourse it's quite clear cut. But with that being said, as I said before, if you like these sorts of videos, please remember to like and subscribe. This is Shinra Hercules, and I'm out.